Welcome. My name is Rich Federman. I'm an associate teaching professor at Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey. I'm part of the Department of Geography, Planning, and Sustainability. Welcome to this learning module. It's called Greening is Cleaning, and I think you'll realize pretty early on what that means and what that entails. This is part of a larger effort being carried out by faculty within my department, partnering with Camden, New Jersey, on ways to use science, education, and community engagement to make Camden a more desirable place to live, a healthier environment for its citizens, and maybe contribute in a small way to making the whole planet a healthier environment for its citizens. So it's great to have you with me. Join me now as we dig into greening is cleaning. So what is the greening is cleaning concept? I'm not going to spend a lot of time reading off the slides to you, but I do want to read this first sentence because it's a good one. Doesn't it simply feel better to be outside, surrounded by green, surrounded by nature? I think almost every one of us would answer yes to that question. Sadly, though, many communities don't provide their residents much or even any opportunity to experience that feeling, the feeling of being surrounded by green, being surrounded by nature in their neighborhood, in their community. That's one of the big goals of this project, right? To empower and to encourage communities like that in Camden to take the time and the effort to plant trees, plant vegetation. And what we're going to be doing over the next, 30 minutes or so, give or take, is exploring the many, many benefits that come from that decision. So before we leave this slide, I just want to call your attention quickly to this green in the city box in the 330-300 rule. Give this a look. What it says is that as a goal, every person in every neighborhood and every community should be able to see 3 substantial trees, at least 3, from their home. They should live in a neighborhood that is at least 30% covered by trees. There's a tree canopy that extends over at least 30% of the neighborhood. And each person should live within 300 meters, which that's about 1,000 feet. Should live within about 1,000 feet of a park of some sort. It doesn't have to be a huge park, doesn't have to be a national park or a state park, but some sort of escape, right? Some place where you can go and feel, in some sense, surrounded by green. Now, in order to accomplish our goal here in the greening is cleaning module, there's going to be science, and that's okay, because science helps us to explain and to understand how our planet works, and that's important because we're part of that planet, we're part of the system. So I think a great way to get a handle on how the Earth works is to think a little bit about these so-called 4 great Earth systems. And these are the 4 circles or spheres that you see on the upper left-hand part of the slide. The atmosphere, or what we call the air, the lithosphere or the geosphere, that's the solid Earth, the hydrosphere, that's the watery part of the world, and the best sphere, because we're part of it, the biosphere. We're going to focus, as the title of the slide makes clear, we're going to focus particularly on a connection between 2 of the 4 spheres, the atmosphere and the biosphere. And we're going to talk a lot about how one particular element moves between the 2. All right, now you might be able to guess right off the bat what that element is, and if you can't guess it, that's okay. Take a little look around the slide here and you'll find the answer. That element is carbon, and we're going to see that carbon plays a huge role and plays many different parts in the story of how, not only how the planet works, but how we work. So there's one word on this slide you may not be familiar with, and that word is sequestration, right? Actually, 2 big words that we're going to encounter on this slide and the next slide, which are very important, are sequestration and photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis, I'm sure you've heard of, or maybe you're very familiar with that process. But sequestration, as it says here, is the way that one sphere can take an element away from or out of another sphere. And I'll end the suspense. The element that we're talking about here is carbon. So you can start to think about, well, how might photosynthesis sequester or take carbon? How might it move carbon from one sphere to the next? Well, the answer to that question, of course, is photosynthesis, right? So if you don't recall off the top of your head the formula for photosynthesis, and it's okay if you don't, I have it for you right here on the slide. So take a look, and you'll notice that you see, right, SEE, a C, the letter C, on both sides of the formula. One of the inputs, so on the left-hand side of the formula, one of the inputs for photosynthesis is CO2. That's carbon dioxide, right? CO2 is found in the atmosphere. And then by the process of photosynthesis, the C winds up in a completely new form on the right side of the equation. It's part of something called glucose. You and I would call that sugar, right? And really what that is food. So photosynthesis is the process by which plants, right, green things, take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, combine that with water, and use the elements involved to make food. Now there's a byproduct of that process, which is very important to you and I and most living things on Earth, and that's oxygen. Photosynthesis is also the process that releases oxygen into the atmosphere for us to breathe. But we are going to be focused here on carbon, right? So, and I encourage you to come back or stop, pause if you can, and take a closer look at some of the graphics and some of the information that I have on the slide, because there's a lot of really good information here. But the big picture message here on this slide is that photosynthesis removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and that's a process that can only be done by green things. It can only be done by plants. Now we probably don't have to spend very much time on this slide, even though it's a good slide. I like the green heart, and the reason is we know the answer to this, right? What kind of green spaces can do this incredible feat of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? Now you might be wondering, why do we want to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? And that's a great question. If you don't know the answer, stay tuned, because we're going to spend quite a bit of time talking about that. But trust me when I tell you that at this point in our journey, the journey of our species, right, human beings, it's very much in our interest to try to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. How do you do that? Well, we can spend millions or billions of dollars on technological solutions, and we are, but it doesn't cost plants a dime, right? Plants have evolved to do this, right? This is what they do. They use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to make food for themselves, for animals, for us, and this is what makes the biosphere go around. So, long story short, any type of green space, virtually any type of green space, can do this trick, can perform this magic of photosynthesis. Right? It doesn't have to be a vast national park. It can be a patch of grass. It can be a garden that you plant. Now, we've already talked a good deal about green things, right? Vegetation, grass, plants, trees, and there's good reason for that. I mean, the learning module is called Greening is Cleaning. But the fact of the matter is there may be an even more important player involved in this game, in this story. Now it goes hand in hand with greening and with vegetation and trees. I'm talking about soil. You may not realize just how important soil is. Well, I can tell you it's probably the most important thing on Earth. There's two things, as a side note, there's two things that we as humans cannot live without. One of them is fresh water, and the other is soil. Right? Why can't we live without soil? Because without soil, we cannot grow food. Why is soil an amazing, amazing ally, though? Well, take a look at some of the information I have for you in this slide. It is, as I say here, the most diverse, vibrant ecosystem on Earth. 8 billion things, 8 billion living things in a patch of soil the size of your bathtub. That's incredible. You see in the drawing, or the diagram rather, to the left, just a tiny fraction of some of the really cool things that live in soil. Now, most of the billion are microscopic, but that doesn't mean they're not important. They're actually very important to the purpose of this learning module, which is to use greening, including healthy soil, to remove carbon from the atmosphere and take it to a place and put it to a purpose that is much more in line with a healthy community and a healthy planet. So we need to love the soil. We're going to see some more reasons why that's true, I believe, on the next slide. The work they do, yes, indeed. Who is the they? Well, you see in the first sentence of the slide, we're talking about the combination of healthy soil and the vegetation that grows in it, the plants, the trees that grow in that healthy soil. And the work that they do, at least for our purposes here in greening and cleaning, at the top of that list is they sequester carbon. Now, we haven't said this explicitly yet in our time together here, but maybe it's time that we do. We are built from carbon. We are carbon-based organisms. In fact, all life on Earth is built from carbon. We have yet to discover a form of life in the universe that is not built from carbon. So right there, you start to realize just how important carbon is to the story of the planet and to us. So we said a few slides back that elements like carbon, they bounce back and forth between these various Earth systems. They spend some time in the biosphere, some time in the atmosphere. And what we want, and I'm kind of showing my hand here, what we want is we want to maximize the time that the carbon spends in the biosphere. Right? Why? Because that's where it can build life. Right? That's where carbon can build life. And when it's in the atmosphere, in the form of carbon dioxide, it has some very negative impacts on our environment, particularly with respect to what it's doing to our climate, and much more on that to come in the next few slides. So how and where does the biosphere capture carbon? That's what this slide is about. You see that you can think about three ways. The carbon is it's the connector between the trees and the soil, right? It's in the roots, the branches, the leaves. It's also moving to number two. It's also, as I said, it's what all the living things are built out of, right? If there's a fox, if there's a bunny, anything that's out there is built from carbon. It has carbon in its body and its cells. So those are the uses for carbon that we'd like. Now, number three, we haven't talked about yet, but it's very important, and this is where the healthy soil comes back into the story, because soil can hold an incredible amount of carbon. So introduce a term for you here, soil organic carbon, SOC. And I noted the fact that, as the diagram said, SOC can act as a carbon sink for thousands of years. So in other words, this is a productive, healthy place to store carbon for thousands of years. And, oh, by the way, that's carbon that will not be in the atmosphere for a thousand years or more. On the last slide, we talked about how all life on Earth is carbon-based, and all the important molecules that make up living things on planet Earth are built from carbon. Proteins, fats, sugars, DNA, as I mentioned on this slide. We have to do a little bit of chemistry together right here, because atoms of any element, including carbon, are made up of three things: protons and neutrons, which are found in the nucleus, and electrons, which kind of fly around in these orbits or shells. But it's not a random situation. The number of electrons varies from element to element, and that's actually how we get the atomic number of the element, or where it sits on the good old periodic table. But these shells are defined, and each shell can only hold a certain number of electrons. Now, what happens is, if an element, for example, carbon, does not have its outer shell completely filled with electrons, And if you look at the diagram at the center of the slide, that second shell, you'll see it has 4 little minus signs circling. It has 4 electrons, and this is a carbon atom. Well, that second shell can actually hold 8 electrons. So carbon is only half full, electron-wise, in its outer shell. All elements really want their outermost shell to be full. So what this means for carbon is it needs to kind of go out into the elemental market and find 4 electrons to fill up that outer shell. Now that may seem kind of strange, but what happens really isn't strange at all. What it means is that carbon combines, it bonds, it melds with other elements. And that's how we get compounds, right? So, for example, CO2, right, is a mixture of carbon and oxygen. Methane is a mixture of carbon and hydrogen. And methane is a good example. Now, you see on the graphic to the left, methane is the formula, the chemical formula for methane is CH4. So, in other words, one molecule of methane contains 1 carbon atom and 4 hydrogens. Well, hydrogen is the simplest element. It's number 1 on the table, and it only has 1 electron. So what happens when methane forms is that 1 carbon atom, now remember we said that every carbon atom is in the market for 4 additional electrons. Well, methane solves that problem by finding 4 hydrogen atoms to bond with. That carbon is able to kind of share that electron with each of the 4 hydrogens, and that fills up the outer shell. It takes carbon's outer shell from having 4 electrons to having 8, fills the shell, and that in essence creates a stable compound, which methane is. What is the point of all this, and why bring it up? It's the fact that carbon needs 4 additional electrons in its outer shell explains why carbon is so reactive, which in turn explains why carbon is the basis for all life on Earth, because it so readily combines with all the other elements, or many of the other key elements that we find on Earth. Yes, keep your eye on the carbon. And as I mentioned on the slide, the trick really is to maximize carbon's ability to do what it does best. Right? In other words, we want to maximize the amount of carbon in the biosphere where it can build life and support life and sustain life, and we want to reduce the amount of hydrogen in the other spheres, particularly in the atmosphere, where, as we've talked about, it exists in the form of CO2, which is impacting the climate. How do we accomplish this? Well, you see the green writing on the slide. Right? Plants, right? Plants. Vegetation is the answer, right? Green things can do this trick. They perform photosynthesis, and photosynthesis takes the carbon out of the atmosphere and brings it into the plant, and then eventually, as the plant gets eaten by animals, say, moves the carbon into the animals. Just to kind of put a cap on this little part of the discussion, we build our bodies. Our bodies are built with the carbon that we got from eating plants or from eating animals that ate plants. So that's the chain. The carbon starts in the atmosphere. It is taken in or sequestered by the vegetation to do photosynthesis. It's changed into a form that we can digest, right? The glucose, the sugar, and then it works its way throughout the food chain or the food web and enables all those different creatures, us included, to build their cells and build their bodies. Well, folks, now it's time to turn our attention to the why question. Why do we want to remove carbon from the atmosphere? And I think you're probably at least to some extent aware of the answer. It has to do with the fact that by putting excess carbon, now remember the form that carbon takes in the atmosphere. So now we're talking about carbon dioxide, right? That's the form that carbon exists in the atmosphere. And that's super important because carbon dioxide is what we call a greenhouse gas. What greenhouse gases do, and this is what the slide you're looking at right now is about, what greenhouse gases do is that they trap excess heat in the lower atmosphere, right? The part of the atmosphere where we live. They warm the planet up. Well, That in and of itself is not unnatural. Carbon dioxide has, for billions of years, carbon dioxide has been part of the Earth's atmosphere, and it sort of acts like a thermostat that, you know, turns the temperature up and down, over millions and billions of years. But what is unnatural is the fact that by burning fossil fuels, we humans over the past couple hundred years, but particularly over the past 50 years or so, we have really, really been ratcheting up the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And when in the atmosphere, carbon dioxide does its thing, right? It acts as a greenhouse gas. So as we've increased the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, it's accumulated and it has in turn warmed the planet. All right? And that warming is real, and it's intensifying, right? It's accelerating. And that is a dangerous thing and a scary thing for really most life on Earth, including human beings. What you see on this slide are the reasons why the statement I ended the last slide with is true. So this is a slide of consequences. These are consequences of a buildup of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, right? Excess carbon dioxide accumulating in our atmosphere over the past, as I said, 200, but particularly the last, 30 to 50 years, as a result of burning fossil fuels, right? Gas, coal, and oil. These are the things that are happening, right? Unfortunately, these aren't predictions. These are already realities. Whether you're talking about the impacts of rising sea levels on coastal communities, whether you're talking about, the heat-related illnesses and the suffering that comes along with that, whether you're talking about, more frequent droughts. It's not just the atmosphere that's warming, it's also the oceans, and that's very important and dangerous because ocean water is the source of energy for storms, particularly tropical storms like hurricanes. And the warmer the ocean water, the more powerful those storms are and will become. So in essence, extreme will become the new normal, and already is becoming the new normal when it comes to weather and climate. We're not the only species by a long shot suffering the consequences, right? We're losing species around the world at an alarming rate, and one of the significant contributors to that loss of biodiversity is the changing climate. So there's a lot of very, very good reasons for us and all of our friends on the planet of various species to remove excess carbon from the atmosphere, as this slide says. So we've been talking over these last few slides about the ways that greening, right, encouraging the growth of vegetation and plants and trees, can help us to lessen the impacts or even reverse the impacts of a warming planet by sequestering carbon in the form of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But I have even better news, because it turns out that, as you see on the slide, greening helps the biosphere in other ways, in many other ways. So I want to share some of those positive outcomes and some of those great possibilities with you here over these next few slides. And it really can be accomplished by something as local as a rain garden. All right, this is something that you may be able to do on your very own property, or that you and your friends can make happen in your community. So let's explore some of these other benefits of greening. We all realize that forests are places where creatures live. They're excellent habitat, and unfortunately, habitat for animals of all sorts and plants as well, habitat's been decreasing for a long time around the planet. And I mentioned on the slide that the loss of habitat is actually the #1 reason why so many species are going extinct. Well, what can we do to stem the tide, right? What can we do to try to provide more habitat? You know it. The answer is greening, because whether it's a forest, whether it's a small patch of woodland, whether it's a grassy field, whether it's a rain garden, right? All of these different types of habitats provide homes to a vast variety of species, and it really doesn't take that much to attract life. Right? Even a community project, right? Even something that's less than an acre in size will attract and maintain a surprising amount of life, a variety of life. So greening, in addition to helping to reverse the impacts of a warming climate, it also can help us reverse the impacts of what is unfortunately quickly becoming a mass extinction event on our planet. Have you ever heard of impervious surface? Well, even if you haven't heard that term, you're aware of what it means. This is another way that greening and vegetation can help our communities. Impervious surface refers to hard surfaces that water cannot penetrate. Can you think of some of those? Right? Think about an urban environment. Maybe you live in an urban environment. Think about how much of the area around you is impervious, right? So this could be road, this could be sidewalk, this could be roofs of houses, it could be parking lots, right? Empty lots, concrete, anything that water cannot soak into. Now, vegetation, on the other hand, is the opposite, right? Water can easily sink into and soak into vegetation. Well, that's good for the vegetation, but it's also good for us. And here's the big message from this slide, because when we get rain and particularly storms, and remember storms are going to be becoming more intense because of the greenhouse effect. When those storms occur, if the water can't go down, right? If the water cannot soak down into the ground, into the soil, then it's going to run very quickly to the lowest place. Now that could be a local stream, which will then flood. That could be, as you see in this picture, the low point of a road. It could be someone's home, right? A very dangerous situation. So we can make our lives safer by greening. It does keep our water cleaner too, yes. So I know that this is a learning module that's focused primarily on air quality and threats to air quality, but greening, vegetation, it's one of the best ways that we can keep our water safe, right? So now we're visiting the hydrosphere, another one of those great Earth systems. And I mentioned earlier that the two things that people can't live without are clean water and soil, right? We've investigated some of the reasons why soil is so important, but it's obvious to all of us that clean drinking water, clean water for our farms, for our families is equally important. So this slide gives you information about how plants actually filter the water, right? So it's called photoremediation, as you see, another big word on the slide, but the concept is pretty easy to wrap your mind around. And it really, again, it goes back to the fact that the vegetation and soil is permeable, right? It allows water to run over it and through it. And as that happens, and you can get details by taking a look around the slide, as that happens, that water is cleaned. It's cleaned in a couple different ways, by physical processes and by chemical processes. But the important message here, just to kind of keep it at the surface, so to speak, is that our vegetation, our plants clean our water for us, right? And a lot of the water that we use is actually what's called groundwater. We pump it out. We have wells that pump water out of the ground. Well, the reason that we often can feel confident in the fact that that water is going to be clean and pristine and safe is because the job done by vegetation, as what started out as rain and runoff and so forth, makes its way down through the vegetation and through the soil down to the groundwater. So here's another big benefit to greening in your community: cleaner water. So friends, there's one more big topic I'd like to discuss with you here in our Greening is Cleaning learning module, and that's farming, how we grow our food. And I'd like to introduce you to this idea called regenerative agriculture, or sustainable farming. This is a huge opportunity. It really is. Now, sadly, very little of the farming that's happening right now across our country is done using these principles of sustainability or regeneration. But that could change, and if it does change, that really, really opens up a door, not only to to sequester, you know, unthinkable amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. This is a solution that literally could not only slow, the artificial warming of the planet, but stop and even reverse that warming. But it also will allow us to save one of those two key aspects of the earth that we said we can't live without, and that's soil, because we are not doing a very good job as farming is currently constructed in protecting or even saving our soil. We're losing soil. We're losing soil. We're losing it to erosion. We're losing, the nutrient value of the soil is being diminished. And just literally large portions of the world are desertifying, right? Soil is being turned into dirt and into desert. These are ideas and these are ways to reverse that trend. So please join me and take a look at some of the ideas that I have for you on this and these next couple slides. Well, if you had a chance to look at the 4 or 5 key principles of regenerative agriculture on the last slide, and then perhaps take a closer look at the information on this slide, you'll see that the answers, right, the solutions, they're pretty easy to wrap your mind around, right? Again, it's sort of like with the whole idea of greening is cleaning. It's a very low-tech solution, right? Plant trees, plant gardens, and the same I think is true to some extent with how to farm more sustainably, right? So what are those key ideas? Well, treating the soil with care. That's at the top of the list. Keeping green things on the land, right? Keeping vegetation, keeping crops on the land, right? No bare land, right? No bare soil that's subject to erosion and being blown away by the winds. Livestock, right? The animals that farmers raise, they're part of that too. And what the regenerative model talks about is bringing livestock back onto the farm, right? Because livestock actually enhance the growing process. It's so many of these answers are really holistic when you think about them. Nature works best when it's allowed to work together. And we've kind of, in our farming practices, we've kind of separated everything out, right? We've taken the livestock away and put them in feedlots, right? We've taken the crops off the land. We've even taken the microbes out of the soil, and all of these practices are very, very damaging, and particularly to the soil, which we've seen is sort of the heart and the key to this whole this whole process of saving the planet and greening the planet. So again, take a moment, think about these 4 banners that I have for you down at the lower part of the slide. These are 4 benefits that will come out of going about our farming and our agriculture in a different way. You see lower costs, right? This can make sense economically. Like so many of these big ideas will only fly if they do make sense economically, and regenerative agriculture does make sense economically. Right, safer lives, no use of chemicals, right? Really reducing the amount of chemicals that we put on our food. That's healthier for everyone. On the next slide, we'll think about how you and I, even on our local level, can contribute. Yes, you can help by what you eat. Absolutely. Eating is one of the most impactful things that we do, not only obviously for ourselves and our growth, but it also says a lot about our what we value and our relationship with our community and with the planet. And by the little decisions that each of us make, where we shop, what we shop for, thinking about where our food comes from and how it was grown, how it was produced, we want to try to align ourselves with the people who are doing things the right way, right? With the people who are raising our food or growing our food using these sustainable practices. You see number 1 on the list there, how to eat a regenerative diet. The first bullet says buy from local regenerative farmers, and those types of farming operations may not be available in your area, but it's so important to support local growers, right? This is literally, in the most, in the most literal way, a grassroots movement. If we can show at a local level that this works, right, that the sustainable model for growing food and consuming food works, then that's an example that can then work its way up the ladder until, hopefully we reach a point where even the largest growers are convinced that, yeah, this is the way to go. These are the practices that we want to use, not only to save the planet, because this is what our buyers, this is what our consumers want. Hopefully I've convinced you by now that there really are an incredible amount of benefits to greening, right? The greening is cleaning concept, to introducing more green into our communities, as I say on the slide, whether it's creating a rain garden, planting trees, allowing grass to grow, whether it's more crop cover on a farm field, from sequestering that carbon out of the atmosphere and reducing the negative impacts of the consequences of a warming planet, to cleaning our water, to saving species, and just making our lives better. Thinking about things like the 330-300 rule, and just the health benefits and the psychological benefits to having green spaces in our communities. And I hope that this program and this learning module plays a small role in helping us to have more green spaces in our communities. Yeah, I have for you on this slide some discussion questions. If this is something that you would be interested in, to help keep the conversation going. These are questions that can be answered by students. They can be talked about informally, and maybe are a good way to go back and reconnect with many of the key points here in the Greening is Cleaning learning module. I have for you, lastly on this slide, some links to resources that you may be interested in and that you may want to check out. If you would like to learn more about the regenerative farming movement, I do recommend the documentary called Kiss the Ground, which came out about 5 years ago. But there are just so many great resources out there, and so many ways to get involved, no matter where you live, in greening projects and projects aimed to making our communities and our environments more healthy. And greening is a great way to get to that goal. So thank you so much for joining me and for listening.